Okay, we've got people joining us from all over the world, and I want to say a special, special welcome for those of you who are beaming in from afar, and particularly on this Valentine's Day, at least here in the United States. So I want to welcome you to the inaugural run of the Roger Fisher Speakers Series. We're going to dive into just better understanding Roger himself, from his experiences growing up and in World War II and the ways in which this led him to reach out, to collaborate with others, to really find better ways to manage our differences in this broken world. I am lucky enough to be joined by several important people from Roger's life. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they met Roger. So we're going to start with Peter Fisher. Peter Fisher is one of Roger's two sons. So we can assume, Peter, you don't remember meeting Roger in the first moment. However, we are delighted to have you here. Peter has served as Undersecretary of the Treasury. He is currently at BlackRock, and he can give us a little bit of insight in what it was like to grow up with Roger and watch him at work. I'm also joined by Bruce Patton. Bruce is a co-founder of the Negotiation Project. You met Roger when you were still a college student, and were a central part of his early work, including being a co-author on Getting to Yes, as well as a few decades later, now working with Congress, doing what you can to save democracy. Finally, we are joined by Dr. Baba Jallow. Dr. Jallow is our inaugural Fisher Fellow at Harvard Law School, and has joined us for the year, close on the heels of his work as the head of the Gambian Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations Committee, helping to heal that society. And we're going to hear a little bit about Dr. Jallow's work as he continues really the spirit and practicality and optimism that I think Roger brought to all of his work. So welcome, Dr. Jallow.
Thank you.
Baba, I'm going to turn over to you, actually, because this speaker series was your idea. Do you want to say a little bit about what you had in mind?
Thank you, Sheila. Yes, when I was appointed the inaugural Fisher Fellow, I looked at the terms of reference again in the appointment letter, and one of the items there says that, your responsibility, part of your responsibility is to keep the legacy and life work of Roger Fisher alive. And so I thought one of the best ways to do that would be to introduce a speaker series that would run at least twice in the fall and in the spring semesters at Harvard Law School, and bring together practitioners and colleagues and people interested around the world, not only at Harvard Law School, at Harvard University, but around the world, people interested in negotiation and conflict resolution, and bringing about peace and harmony in societies, because that is really what Roger Fisher wanted to do, was doing during his career. And so I thought one of the best ways to do that would be to start a Fisher speaker series. And so I wrote a proposal and sent it to the dean of the law school, John Manning, and he was gracious, very gracious. He consulted with you, Sheila, and others. And then, happily, the proposal was approved. And I worked very closely with you and Nicole and the program on negotiation to start this speaker series. And so I'm happy that this speaker series has started, because it would not only bring together practitioners and keep Roger Fisher's legacy alive, it will also continue the work on the negotiation revolution that they speak about in Getting to Yes. And the main item there, the main issue there would be to reduce positional bargaining and promote principled negotiation. And I think that is work that needs to be known, that needs to be spread forward, that needs to be an ongoing conversation to help societies heal. Roger, just like William Urey, is a possibilist. He believes that conflict is inevitable, but that every conflict can be resolved through the method that they outline in Getting to Yes. So I would just say that it's meant also to continue the negotiation revolution and to promote the idea of principled negotiation, and also direct people to Getting to Yes. I think that's a book that people need to read. It could solve conflicts everywhere. And so I think that is why I decided to propose a speaker series, and I'm happy that Harvard Law School welcomed the idea and approved it, and we are starting on Valentine's Day. To love to Roger and his family. Thank you. I'm
still
not
learning
hearing.
I'm still learning to use Zoom after all this time. I was just saying that I loved the idea when you brought it to us. And I feel incredibly lucky to be working alongside you, Baba. My name is Sheila Heen. I met Roger when I was a law student in the 90s, joined the negotiation project, and these days am entrusted with the teaching of negotiation at Harvard Law School, which feels like a responsibility to keep that possibilism alive. And I think that it's striking to me that the moment that we're in this world can feel pretty dark, from COVID to the wars we have raging right now. And I was reminded recently that Roger's passion and drive to try to find better ways to handle our differences really came out of his experiences during a very dark time. Roger served in World War II. He served in both the Atlantic and the Pacific as a weatherman, which was not a super survivable job, since they would send you up in the nose of a B-29 so that you could check out the weather over Germany and Japan, and radio back to let them know whether it was a good time to send up a mission and whether it was a go and how much fuel you would need. Roger had a very good view of the weather, but he also had a view of the people shooting at him from the ground. And he was usually accompanied by a couple other planes, and while they were up there, they might as well drop a few bombs. And practical as he was, insightful as he was, as Roger always told the story, he thought, well, the only reason they're shooting at us is because we're dropping a couple of bombs on them while we're up here. If we just sent the weather plane alone, it might take a couple of rounds for them to catch on. But then I'll get better readings because I won't be dodging. We won't be dodging the planes they've sent up scrambled to come after us. So I'll get better weather readings, and also they'll stop shooting at me. And he proposed this. This is early negotiation effort on his part to his commanding officer, who ran it up the chain and came back down, and as I understand it, said, look, if you can persuade your crewmates, it's your skin. So he persuaded his crewmates that we could influence them. They will stop shooting at us if we stop dropping bombs on them. And in fact, it worked beautifully. And it took a couple of rounds. He was working out over Japan, checking weather at the time, and it took a couple of rounds, but in fact, they did stop shooting at him. They caught on. Both sides were using weather planes, right? So it wasn't a secret. However, that practice was why a few months later, the Enola Gay, which carried the atom bomb, was sent alone. It was sent to mimic the weather plane. And what they only learned later was that not only had Japan stopped shooting at them and scrambling their fighters when they heard the weather plane coming over, they also had stopped hitting the air raid sirens. And so the casualties that day were higher than anyone expected because of that practice, a totally unforeseeable impact. Roger's experience with that, and also the fact that he came home and found that all of his college roommates who had stopped out to go to war together, of all of them, he was the only one who came back. And he talked a lot about that being a big piece of what drove him to think there's got to be a better way. What became known as win-win negotiation was driven in part by his very real life experience that there is also a lose-lose. And that both sides lose if we can't find better ways. Peter, you grew up with Roger's optimism. We're super curious about your observations. I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Sheila. Yeah, I thought it's one of the hardest things to convey my father's spirit and how he comported himself, carried himself, to realize he spent almost all his waking hours thinking about the worst things going on the planet. He would be riveted by the war in the Ukraine and its implications for European security, Gaza and the Mideast. He wouldn't be missing the refugees across Southeast Asia and the conflicts there, the guerrilla wars taking place in Africa, migrant crisis across the Rio Grande and Mediterranean. He'd be riveted with all of that, all the most gloomy things going on in the world, without a hint of anger or solidarity with either of the competing parties. He would be comported with an extraordinary optimism about how a few good ideas and a few good people could make a real difference. And the incongruity of this is his constant attention on conflict and war and this amazing sense of optimism. As the obituary in The Economist, his obituary in The Economist put it, and let me make sure I get it, with that sunny confidence he always had, he knew he could make the world a better place. And it was quite, I don't know, I've never met another character who could do that cognitive dissonance that takes place. The other thing he had, in addition to optimism, I would say, were penetrating powers of empathy. He could put himself in your shoes or in someone else's shoes in ways that I think really motivated much of his work. The whole idea of currently perceived choice. He would see how someone else sees it now and then see how it could change their perception of their choices. It's what made him, I think, an extraordinary lawyer, an advocate. He could put himself in the shoes of the other party, put himself in the shoes of the justices he was addressing. And it also, he was able to help you with your powers of empathy. He could encourage you to be empathetic, as he famously did and caught for film for PBS President Nasser of Egypt, getting Nasser to laugh at himself, realizing the trouble that Golda Meir would be in if she agreed with Nasser's demands. And he got Nasser in just a few sentences to realize how ridiculous that was. She could never agree to what you've proposed. And so this being drawn to conflicts with both optimism and empathy was something deep in his character that I don't think I'll find another human I'll ever meet who has quite the same combination. And it's worth thinking about when we think about all the gloomy things going on in the world. And it's a great, it's sort of slap in the face for us all. Anyway, back to you, Sheila.
You're reminding me that one of the things that he always said was, well, it's always the right time to do something, right?
Yes.
It may not be that we can do everything or our first idea or what we think would be ideal, but there's got to be something where we can move the needle just a little bit to set up the next thing that maybe would need to happen. And I vividly recall him sitting in his office, opening up the newspaper when we used to hold newspapers in our hands, and, reading an article, and he would just jump in and start working on it without anybody asking him to or inviting his advice. And then he would fax his advice off to the people involved if he could find their fax numbers. And all these people all over the world were getting these faxes from some guy named Roger Fisher, saying, who is this guy? And every once in a while, somebody would call him back, say, these are kind of interesting ideas. Bruce, you met Roger when he was still very focused on sort of how do I intervene and help train people to intervene in international conflict. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, he taught an undergraduate course called Coping with International Conflict when I was a senior at the college. And, nobody else really teaches anything like that. And Roger said, you're going to spend the semester by picking some aspect of the world you don't like, analyzing what gets in the way and what it would look like to be better, and then proposing what someone should do about it, and then write sort of a memo to them in a way that would increase the odds that they would do something different. And an A paper is one that I send with a cover letter saying, hey, guy, I think you should read this.
Wow. Wow. And
sent off
how old were you at the time? These are undergraduates, right?
These were undergraduates. I was 20.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was one of the things I always appreciated about him, which is that he thought great ideas could come from anywhere.
He was
He
always
really
open.
treated you as someone who actually could have some good ideas that would actually help, despite all the experts who've been working on it their whole careers.
It was the most attractive thing about Roger as a mentor. He would listen to anybody who came in his office and share his whatever was on his mind and say, you know, what do you think?
Yeah.
And he was so serious about listening. You thought really hard and tried to give, you know, useful feedback.
Well, that was another thing about him, Bruce, that I would love to hear a little bit more about, which is how collaborative he was. He did not stay in his academic silo. Not only did he keep a foot in the real world working on real problems, but he also reached out to people in other disciplines, in other places who were doing relevant work, right? Thomas Schelling and Howard Rafa, and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so there's a history to that. I mean, when you think about it, what Roger was trying to do was build very high quality theory for changing the world.
Mm-hmm.
And in an academic context, you know, there are all kinds of standards for studying the way the world is. And, you know, you have to be empirical and have good evidence. It is much more difficult to think about how the world should be and what it would take to change it. That's action research, and it's normative research. What Roger, I think, demonstrated is that you can bring a very rigorous set of standards for how to build and what constitutes good ideas like that. And the history started with something that was called the Arms Control Seminar at Harvard, where all through the 60s, Stanley Hoffman and Henry Kissinger and Tom Schelling and Howard Rafa and Roger and others would get together regularly and assess the state of, you know, the arms race and think about what they'd each learned in the last period of time and where there were potential opportunities to do something effective to, you know, reduce the risks. And what they learned is, you know, as they brainstormed, somebody would come up with an idea and everybody would say, that's a good idea. And a couple of things emerged from that. One, if you've got the smartest brains around and they've vetted an idea, there's a pretty good chance that that's, you know, not going to have an unintended consequence. And unintended consequences are the bane of people trying to change the world. But the second thing really was the importance of brainstorming and taking good ideas and asking, all right, everybody agrees that's a good idea. And we've now tried it out several times and it's worked. Why is it a good idea? That you can deconstruct the theory of a good idea and turn it into a principle, you know, illuminate the underlying principles like a good lawyer, and then try it out in other circumstances and discover the limits of it when it, you know, doesn't work. And the other thing that came into our practice really as a discipline was when we started teaching negotiation and really trying to teach young, bright students how to do what we were doing. We thought we'd captured the ideas, and yet inevitably we would try and teach them, and a whole bunch of people would not do anything remotely like what we thought made sense. And that's really a really clear discipline that there's something you haven't captured yet. And we'd keep working at it until bright young people would relatively reliably do the same kinds of things that we thought made sense. And at that point, we felt like we could write it down in a book like Getting to Yes, and having put it both to the discipline of the young students and the discipline of, you know, Tom Schelling, who would critique anything, or Stanley Hoffman, if they were both sort of giving us a thumbs up, then it probably was pretty high quality ideas.
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
I just want to jump in and add one more thing, which was special, was how much that collaboration Bruce was just describing meant to each of the participants in their own work, and how difficult it is in academic settings to get that kind of collaboration going. At Roger's memorial service, Howard Rafa came up to me and very generously said he thought it was underappreciated how much those conversations meant to the work he'd done and the work Tom Schelling had done. They went back to their disciplines and added degrees of insight that they wouldn't have had if they hadn't all been together.
Yeah, I think that they were so dedicated to experimenting, hearing each other, experimenting, learning, and revising. Roger was never afraid to make mistakes, and he never hesitated to think he had something to learn from someone else. I can see in the chat that we have some of our additional collaborators over the years joining us. Keith Fitzgerald, who was Roger's assistant for a number of years, is remembering that he would often, his sense of humor, of course, was so wonderful and delightful. And he would always say, the worst things are, the more room there is for improvement. I mean, why wouldn't we get started, right? And Jim Tull, who was hired at Conflict Management Group, one of Roger's nonprofit organizations, had negotiated his own release from a hostage situation. And, you know, Roger thought, well, this guy probably has something he can teach us, and he's got the right instincts, right? So it's one of the things that I really appreciated was just how practical he was and how willing he was to build a teaching pedagogy that encouraged people to make mistakes and learn from their mistakes and to learn from their experience. And he was always revising the tools. So his goal was to create tools, and he wasn't afraid to think, well, the way we usually do this doesn't seem to work very well. Maybe we could do it better. My recollection, Bruce, is that the one text came out of experimenting with how do we get past the my offer versus your offer haggling thing, particularly when the issues are really complex and often there are multiple parties at the table. Tell us a little bit about that.
Roger had no pride of authorship. He didn't believe in not invented here. And the one text actually is something we learned about from Louis Sohn, who was a professor of international law at Harvard and so trusted that, you know, people all over the world, even though he'd represented the US in some negotiations, he was often picked to run multilateral, you know, discussions because people just trusted him. And he pointed out that Tommy Koh, a very experienced Singaporean diplomat who had been involved in a bunch of mind-numbing multilateral negotiations that ground on very slowly, had been appointed to run the Law of the Sea Conference to try and update the Law of the Sea, which was itself a nightmare because the South, you know, wanted all the resources of the sea to be shared equally, but the North had all the resources to mine them, and there were lots and lots of disagreements. And Tommy Koh had invented a procedure that allowed the Law of the Sea to get to a conclusion relatively expeditiously. And his insight was not to ask people to take positions. And if they did take positions, not to take positions on the positions, but just to sort of put up an idea and say, instead of, would you accept this? What would be wrong with this? And the insight is that it's very difficult for politicians, especially under conditions of uncertainty, and they don't know what they can get, to say that they'd accept anything. I've had in my own practice, you know, multiple situations where all politicians reject something, even not knowing what it is, because they can't afford to say yes, right? Somebody else will say they're being weak. But it's easy to criticize. In fact, it's even easier for politicians to criticize, and embedded in every criticism is an interest. And the insight is you take the criticism. So it sounds like you care very much about this. Well, it's not exactly that. And, you know, if you go to a negotiator and say, would you give me a complete and honest list of what you care about? They're going to say, you know, in your dreams. But if you say, what would be wrong with this? And you follow it up by trying to understand, they give you exactly that.
Yeah.
And then you can also explore, all right, I see why you want that. Why do you think you deserve it, given that it's in some conflict with things that other people want? And you can begin to explore legitimacy. And that was the essence of what Coe had done in the Law of the Sea. And we wrote it up in first the International Mediation Guide and then in Getting to Yes as the one text procedure. And, it got used in South Africa for the constitutional talks, where people had positions all over the lot. And we trained members of the business community with the consent of all sides to run these working groups with 2,600 people participating.
Wow.
To talk about different kinds of issues. And it was always, well, here's one proposal that people have made, and we'll cycle through all of them. What would be wrong with this? And amazingly, when you ask people who are in that process, you had people saying there should be 3 branches of Congress or the legislature, and 1 branch and 2 branches, and parliamentary system and presidential. You all agreed on a presidential system in South Africa with a bicameral legislature. How'd you do that? You often hear this very strange answer, or seemingly strange, where they say, well, we didn't really negotiate much over that. We talked through all the options, and at the end of the day, we just agreed to do what made sense. And that's a function of really good process. And Roger, having propagated and proposed that they learn from Tommy Coe, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one of the things that I had found so useful about the tools that he developed, which is that they invite people into a process or a conversation that shifts if I'm a participant or a combatant or a party in the conflict, it shifts my role from being someone who's an advocate for just my view and my outcome, very subtly shifts me into feeling a sense of joint responsibility for understanding the problem better from all sides, and then coming up with a solution that does protect my interests and those I represent. But now I get that it's got to be yesable to everybody else. And in this age of social media, the temptation to just be an advocate for the one thing you care about,
right?
Screw in what anybody else thinks. I think it's a missing piece, opportunities to invite people into a conversation where we are working together to get a better sense of what's going on so that we can brainstorm what might help that represents everybody's interests.
Roger's advice was to put the problem in front of both of us so that we can sit side by side and work on it.
Yeah.
And Javier Calderon, who was on, he had an assignment from Roger when he had a summit with President Fujimori from Peru, when Javier was president of Ecuador, that come up with a picture, of the two of you working side by side. And he did. And it led President Fujimori to call him up the next day and say, now that they've published that picture, we actually have to solve this problem.
Right. Well, that's actually a really interesting observation, which is for those on this webinar who work on systems theory. Roger had a very sophisticated sense of who we need to influence in the broader system, and publishing that piece is going to start to shift the story that's being told publicly about this conflict. And then I know that he also had a practice where he would say, all right, write the victory speech that each side will give, and they'll be on opposite sides of the same piece of paper, because each side has to be able to explain to their stakeholders and constituents why this made sense and we got what we needed from this conflict.
I can't emphasize enough the power of Roger's sort of making the ideas into sort of disciplines, tools.
Yeah.
He got a call from Tony Lewis, who was the foreign affairs correspondent of the New York Times, the day that the Iranian hostages were taken from the embassy in Tehran in 1979. And Tony said, how many hours do you think this is going to go on, Roger? And Roger and I had just been sitting there for the last hour doing an analysis of the currently perceived choice of the students who'd taken them and the Ayatollah Khomeini. And then we looked for relevant standards, and, we thought a deadline was going to be critical, and the only one we could see was the upcoming election, US election, in about 11 months. And the nearest analogy we could find was when North Korea had seized the US spy ship, the Pueblo, and the crew had been, as it turns out, held for 11 months. And Roger said to Tony Lewis, I think it's going to go on for about 11 months, Tony. And he said, what, are you insane? And of course, it went on for 13 months.
Yeah.
And you asked about the victory speech. The next thing we did, as we were thinking about it, was really try to construct a victory speech for President Carter and one for the Ayatollah Khomeini that were somehow consistent. And we wrote them on opposite sides of a piece of paper, and we'd give it to people and say, what do you think? And they'd read one side and nod their head, but they said, okay, we'll turn it over. And inevitably people would, they'd start to go, this can't be right. They both sound good. And we said, how could you get a solution where it was any otherwise, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people don't think that.
Well, and so you guys would regularly do sessions, training sessions that were either joint, all parties involved, like let's give you a common vocabulary for how you want to talk about this, and then we'll jump in or we'll create the common vocabulary. You guys then are entering your own process. As I recall, you did that in South Africa, and then he had a moment of panic.
I don't remember.
You had done sessions for the white government officials.
Yep. We did the Afrikaner cabinet.
And then you were doing a session for the ANC.
We had a week with the ANC negotiating committee. We also did a week Roger did a week with Inkatha, and I did a week in the bush with all PAC, AZAPO, and all the small parties.
So on the theory that the more the players on all sides have a similar set of vocabulary, the better the communication will be.
Right.
I just remember him describing a moment of panic when he was talking to Mandela and suddenly realized that he forgot to tell him that you'd also done a session for the government, the white government.
That's possible. I mean, Mandela and de Klerk were both out of the country when we did both of those sessions, because we did the ANC right after we did the cabinet.
Yeah.
And Mandela came back, he was exhausted, but all of the ANC people said, you absolutely have to see Roger. And there was a fairly long argument when he said, no, I'm going home to dinner. And they finally prevailed on him. And so Roger and I came in with Cyril Ramaphosa and Mohamed Ali Musa and Mandela. And, Mandela said, let's take a picture and thank you so much for what you've done. I want to get out of here. And Roger said, no, we need to talk about some of the things we learned about. And it was like a half an hour meeting when Mandela was exhausted, but he actually got some of the points. And then afterwards, what I remember is afterwards, we went out for a drink with Cyril and Mohamed Ali Musa. And Ali said, Roger, I have never seen anyone interrupt Mandela that much. But it worked.
Well, and also he is someone I learned that interrupting someone in order to understand them better is often well received. Like, whoa, wait, here's my understanding of what you mean, but is that what you mean?
Right.
As opposed to interrupting to say what I think.
Right. And, Cyril and the others had said, Mandela has a much easier time dealing with de Klerk, the Afrikaner president, than he does dealing with Buthelezi, the head of Inkatha, another black man who's seen as a collaborator.
Yeah.
And that's where we, talked about the currently perceived choice chart and went through and said, look at it from Buthelesi's point of view. And people were going, oh my God, Mandela has to see that because we need to solve this problem.
Right. If we're going to get them on board.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that the question of how do you frame in conflict, often it feels like, well, it's traitorous to talk to the other side. as opposed to, of course, you have to talk to the other side. The little, I don't know when it happened, but the moment I remember Roger relaying was realizing, oh, we forgot maybe to tell Mandela that we were also talking with with the government. And so he tells him a little sheepishly, and then Mandela says, oh, well, thank goodness they need it more than us.
Yes,
right?
he did. Yes.
Yeah. And I want to bring Baba back into the conversation because, Baba, you have been a person who has had to wrestle with what can I do on my own? My recollection is that in Gambia, you were running an opposition newspaper, a newspaper that was often critical of the regime, and that eventually you needed to depart just for your own safety, and that you lived in exile for a very long time. Do you want to say a little bit about retaining some sense of optimism, or where it flagged, and what helped you to stay the course? Because then, of course, once the regime did change, you were invited to come back to the country to run the commission, Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations Commission.
That's right, yes. So I was a journalist at the time of the military coup. And, when the government bought the newspaper I was editing, a military government, we decided to start another newspaper called The Independent. And that was seen as some kind of an affront to the military dictatorship. And so I got arrested over and over and over again. And eventually I was declared a non-citizen, and I had to flee to the United States to avoid dying. But I continued writing, speaking up, because silence was not an option. We couldn't keep quiet. If we kept quiet in the face of all the atrocities that were happening, things would have been worse than they otherwise were. And so, the optimism was always there. We couldn't afford to be pessimistic. The only other option to speaking out and making sure that we follow up with the problem until the end was keeping quiet. We could have helped the country slide into chaos. Like we had a civil war in Liberia, we had a civil war in Sierra Leone, and these are just countries that are next door. And we knew all of the factors that led to those civil wars. And we saw a dictatorship that was hell-bent on bringing about those same conditions that led to actual armed conflict in these other countries. And so we chose to keep speaking up, keep pointing out, what should happen, in spite of the fact that the dictator was not listening. We kept it on record, and we kept the pressure on. Because the only other option would have been to keep quiet. So keeping quiet was not an option. So I like to say to myself sometimes that, our partner was resistance. We had to resist. That was, our best alternative to a negotiated agreement, because the government was not prepared to listen. And so, we just had to push on with the conviction, the very firm conviction that eventually the dictatorship was going to fall. And eventually that's what happened. And so that's how I got invited back to Gambia to work on the Truth Commission.
And when you did get invited back to work on the Truth Commission, I know that you've told me that one of the things you wanted to be sure to do was to learn from the mistakes that other Truth Commissions maybe had made, and also how do we want to adapt this to the context that we are in. I know that we're going to have a PON live about this in particular, but can you just share a couple of things that you guys did in order to learn as quickly as you could from others, both successes and mistakes?
Right. So three things happen. One is that every Truth Commission process is informed by the context within which it arose. So the Gambian context had to inform whatever mandate we had to tackle. At the same time, we needed to consult other experiences. So we had delegations visit South Africa and Sierra Leone to learn from their experiences of conflict and truth commissions. We also had nationwide consultations on how the commission should be constituted. And we also read a lot about other truth commissions in Latin America and Africa, and even Europe and Canada. These were all experiences that we consulted. And then eventually we came to the conclusion that essentially a truth commission is a national conversation. It's a national conversation. It's a very difficult national conversation. but it's a conversation that needs to happen. And so because it is a national conversation and everyone has a stake in it, we had to make sure that everyone was included in the conversation. And so we built the institution on the principles of inclusivity and accountability and transparency. So essentially, we made sure everyone was included by both projecting all of the streaming live all of the public hearings and all of the activities. We also had a secretariat that has various units, specialized units. We had a department or a unit on victims, victim support unit, psychosocial support unit. We had a unit that was dedicated to women and gender issues. We had a unit that was dedicated to children and young adults. And all of these units also participated very actively in the work of the commission by going out on outreach activities on what we call the Never Again campaign. Because one of the lessons we learned from other truth commissions was that most of the work of the commission was done by the commissioners alone, with very little support from a very skeletal secretariat. And that meant that even though they did a wonderful job, they could have done better if there was a sense of inclusion in the work of the commission, both inside the institution and outside on a national scale. And we carried it further to a global scale by making sure that all of the events, the activities are streamed live, and that they were on social media and Facebook and radio, so that everyone, whether you wanted to listen to what was going on, whether you agreed with the process or not, you were still part of the conversation because you heard and you saw and you knew what was going on. So that's how we kind of moved away from the traditional model of truth commissions and created what we would like to call a comprehensive model of truth commissions that kind of embraced not only the local society, but also the global society.
So, Baba, this was one of the work that you did, really inventing and improving upon, strengthening the models that had been evolving, over the past couple of decades. Was one of the reasons that as our first Fisher Fellow, your candidacy was so strong, in particular because I think you exemplify Roger's thought that peace is not a piece of paper. Peace is a process, a healing process by which everyone has a seat at a table somewhere, and has a role to play there. So there will be a PON Live to dig even more deeply into your experience. But we have a question in the chat, and by the way, or sorry, not in the chat, in the Q&A. If you have a question, drop it into the Q&A. Bob, I'm going to stick with you for a minute because one of the questions that we have is, what can regular people do? And that question of, well, what's the connection between my local community and larger conflicts that I'm worried about? I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Well, again, it would depend on the context. Is it a citizen of the United States? What a citizen in the United States can do is different from what someone in Gambia or in South Sudan or in Kenya can do. So, but depending on the context, there's always room to participate one way or the other in the conversation that is ongoing in helping resolve conflicts. And I think one thing that everyone can do from anywhere is to start by reading Getting to Yes. Getting to Yes is a very small book, and it has a very beautifully laid out method of principled negotiation that could be helpful in any conflict situation. So, what an individual can do in a particular conflict situation would depend on the context and the type of conflict they are dealing with. But gathering knowledge on negotiation and conflict resolution, maybe registering for one of the PON classes at Harvard would be helpful. Just get more knowledge about the context. Look at similar experiences elsewhere, because that is again one of the recommendations that Roger Fisher makes, that people should learn from other contexts, create a series of options, invent options, and then try to find objective criteria with which to work. If you have a conflict with somebody, don't focus on the person, focus rather on the problem, and try to find a point of shared interest. There's always a shared interest somewhere that needs to be discovered in order to reach a negotiation. So I think that anyone from anywhere can read the book, get some ideas, or learn about negotiation and conflict resolution, and apply it to the particular situation. But one important thing is, please do not focus on the person, focus on the problem instead.
Yeah, beautifully put. And I think that that's also been one of the powerful things for me personally about Roger's work and his tools, which is that they're equally applicable to, you know, a war and influencing the people who are decision makers and have some responsibility there, or what's happening in my house in the next room, right? Inside my own family, my community, et cetera. And, you know, the tools like the one text procedure, like currently perceived choice chart, the circle chart. I just used the circle chart to facilitate a local conflict and got everybody talking about what symptoms they were noticing that they thought needed to be addressed and concerned them, how that they thought what was causing those. So the circle chart tool is also posted and available, and a list of Roger's books also posted and available. And there's a new book coming out in March by Diana McLean Smith. Remind me, Bruce, of the title.
Remaking the Space Between Us.
Remaking the Space Between Us. And it is a collection of examples of people in their own communities reaching out across divides to create a conversation and a set of relationships to address reverberations, microcosms of bigger conflicts. And that book will be out March 26th, 8th?
April 9th, I think.
April 9th. So keep an eye out for that.
Sheila, one of the questions from our old colleague Paul Kramer is, what do you think Roger was most misunderstood about? And I think it's relevant here. There are people still who, I don't know whether they read Getting to Yes. I think some of them do, and some of them have just heard of it, but they sort of dismiss it as, well, yes, of course, it's great to find joint gain solutions, but, sometimes the world is just harder than that. And, you've got real conflicts that have, and people talk about zero-sum conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
The fundamental argument, which you started with, that Getting to Yes makes, is there are no zero-sum conflicts in the world.
Yeah.
In the real world, you can always both lose, or everybody can lose. We can blow up the planet slowly or rapidly, depending on whether it's nuclear war or climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And Roger's fundamental point, his starting point, and the starting point of all the people who worked with him, like Tom Schelling or Howard or Larry Susskind, I mean, they all felt the same thing, is that we're in this together and we can all sink together. We always have a shared interest in avoiding all of us ending up worse off. And that's what Roger would see when he would pick up the paper. Time after, these are people who are handling conflict poorly enough that everybody's ending up worse off. And, we can do better.
Bruce, I think you touched earlier on something that is often misunderstood too, or earlier, about his approach. He doesn't guarantee a good outcome.
No.
He wasn't Panglossian. So what you said about it was going to take 11 months to get the US and the Iranians together. He would be incredibly pragmatic about that.
Yes.
And so, but then to one of the other questions, you have to change the perceived choice of the other party, even if you're in a war with
That's right.
Hamas or with Russia. If you can't change the choice, and sometimes the calendar does it, as in your story, then Roger wouldn't be Panglossian about it. You've got to change the choice. So I think
Roger never used the term win-win, because he thought it gave people the impression that, you were guaranteed to be happy. And he didn't guarantee you'd be happy. You're just better off than you might be otherwise.
Yeah. To one of the other questions, I just want to quickly add, he undoubtedly was most gratified by the difference that was made in South Africa, because he had the thought oh, wouldn't it be great if these ideas could make a difference in South Africa? And then they did. And I'm confident that he would be vexed by the tragedy in the Mideast, given the numbers of years he spent working on it. And a lovely PBS miniseries of 7 episodes they did in 1974 after the Yom Kippur War, hopefully creating a dialogue called Arabs and Israelis. You can go back and look at those, as I recently did, after October 7th, and not a lot has changed in half a century, and that would have vexed him.
Yeah.
Although that series, reportedly, when he finally had to watch it to allow it to be shown in Egypt, led Sadat, as he was watching one of those episodes, to say, "Oh my God, I've got to fly to Jerusalem," according to the ambassador who was with him at the time.
There is a question in the chat about to what extent have these ideas influenced the State Department or upper levels of our own government. I can offer that a colleague of ours who teaches with us in the winter, Ariel Ekblad, was at the State Department until recently and was charged with creating a negotiation support function within the State Department. And Ariel teaches with us here at Harvard. So certainly even recently, right? Back in the day with Thomas Schelling, threads throughout, and even recently, but holding on to that optimism, holding on to that approach, it's always a choice to come at it in a more productive way. And the question of what can be done when also the system is set up to fan the flames of divisiveness and choice maybe brings us, Bruce, to hear a couple of minutes on the work that you're doing with Congress here in the US. How is that for a setup?
Well, the State Department has sort of waxed and waned in how familiar it is with some of these ideas. Congress pretty much has only waned. I mean, with the exception of, some standouts. One of the reasons that Ted Kennedy was respected even by people who disagreed with him on politics is that he was very pragmatic about how you get things done and patient. Roger would tell the story of he'd go to George McGovern, who was very progressive, and persuade him to do something, and McGovern would say, okay, and he'd make a speech, and he'd think he was done. And nothing would happen. Roger would go to Ted Kennedy, and he'd say, well, if we're going to make that happen, we're going to need a farm state senator, and probably the best guy for that would be this guy, because he cares about it a little bit. He'll want ethanol for that, and he'd start putting together the elements of a package to influence enough people's choice. And it's a discipline, but it's rare in Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And we're particularly, for social media reasons and just cycles of conflict. I mean, when you get far enough away from violent conflict like World War II, people forget the lesson that you have to make sacrifices to keep a peaceful system in place. Early on in our work, we discovered a study from the RAND Corporation that looked at relationships between school boards and teachers' unions. And they found that the best working relationships were in systems that had had the worst histories fairly recently.
Mm.
And the hypothesis was, if things are bad enough long enough, enough people finally realize that they're together creating that. They attack each other, and the public thinks they're all, sort of sleazebags. So the public won't put any more money into education. And finally, they realize, no, actually, we want the public to see us as, dedicated servants who are trying to do the best we can with too little resources.
Mm-hmm.
And then it changes, but it only changes for a while. You get 10 or 15 years of working together and realizing you have to be respectful, and then somebody comes and people have forgotten and says, they're having too many dinners with management, hire me and I'll beat them into submission. And it goes again. And we are, Roger and his generation of folks like Howard Rafa and Tom Schelling and others had that clearly in mind. And today our politics has sort of forgotten that things really can blow up. But we had a civil war 75 years before, World War II, and we had a Revolutionary War 75 years before that. And there's sort of this cycle. And I think the work I'm doing now, really, it's a long shot, but it's better than nothing, right? Is to see, can we go through the next cycle without having to pay the price in terms of violence, to remind people that making a system work requires norms.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're speaking in part, Bruce, to a theme in the questions in the chat that maybe we'll wrap with, which is, well, what about when there's strong emotion involved? What about when people so mistrust each other? What about when we're so divided? And do all people have the psychological resources to step into a place to have empathy or see the other side? And I would say, maybe just personally for myself, that I think I have those, and not all the time.
Right.
Right? Like when we feel unheard, embattled, afraid, in pain, we lose that curiosity about other people's perspective. We lose the ability to see the whole picture. But the beautiful thing, the challenging thing and the beautiful thing about human beings is that most of us do carry the ability, when we do feel seen or heard, or that what we can do matters and who we are matters, that we can step into a place to reconnect with that empathy. All the research on mirror neurons and our ability to step into someone else's shoes, but that when we're angry and frustrated, we don't have that reaction. That we're not that interested in why the other person is doing what they're doing. And in conflict, that's where we go. So part of what Roger's work is about is tapping that capacity, I think, in human beings to step back and to see the bigger picture and to get creative with each other about how to change what is hurting all of us in many cases.
No one should think that the conflicts Roger made a difference in didn't have those absolutely emotional partisan perceptions and reactions. And Roger persevered despite that. And Roger's mantra was, you don't want a crazy doctor in the insane asylum. When we're not at our best, the task of an interventionist is to help recall us to the bigger picture. And that's what he would do through the empathy that he could bring. First, he would help show that he understood where you were coming from. I mean, ABC News sent Roger to Afghanistan when the Russians were, in charge there and being criticized for it. And he went to see the Soviet ambassador, and the first thing he said is, let me see if I understand why it's so ridiculous for people to demand Russia that the Soviet Union withdraw. Let me look at your choice.
Yeah. He always started with, help me understand where you are. Here's what I think I already get.
Right.
Which then invited them into that space, being seen. I think that one of the beautiful things, and many of Roger's colleagues have joined us today. Bob Manukin took forward the work at Harvard, and many of the people who had some contact with Roger then went out and are working all over the world doing that work. And I want to thank each of you, Peter and Bruce and Baba, for joining us today. I also want to thank everybody who either is here now, taking time out of your busy lives to join us, or will watch this recording, because I think the more people have that sense of hope, equipped with some practical skills and theory for practitioners to go into your communities, and to make a difference, and to carry that sense of both empathy and optimism. That's the hope for a better world on every block. That's also part of the mission of the program on negotiation and the Harvard Negotiation Project. So as we close on this wonderful Valentine's Day, I want to thank PON for sponsoring this PON Live. And I also want to highlight a few upcoming events, both in person and virtual. so that you have the opportunity to learn more, or that we have the opportunity to support the work that you're doing in the corner of the world that you are in. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of the week.